In 1918, Sinn Féin, an Irish Republican party, won an election on the basis that they would withdraw from the British Parliament, secede from the British Empire, and declare an Irish Republic. From the middle of 1920 to the summer of 1921, both the IRA insurgency and British repression produced about 2,000 deaths in Ireland. This is known as the War of Independence. In July 1921, a truce was arranged between British and Irish Republican armies. On December 6, 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty between Great Britain and Ireland was signed in London. This allowed a considerable degree of freedom for the 26 southern countries of Ireland. The British military was to be withdrawn from Ireland. Finally, the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was the Irish police force, was terminated. However, the settlement dissolved the Republic, and the members of the Parliament were to swear allegiance to the British monarch. There was still British military stationed in Ireland. Because of these faults in the treaty, many Irish republics and nationalists viewed the treaty as a step backwards. In January 1922, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was passed, but because of the protests, President Eamon de Valera and his two ministers resigned. He declined to include himself in any treaty negotiations, but he promoted a revision in the treaty where Ireland and the British Commonwealth would be superficially associated. Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, the head of the treaty signing, formed a provisional government to oversee the handover of power from the British to the new Ireland. But due to the split in the ranks of the Irish Republican Army, Collins began to link a new national army in February of 1922. In March of 1922, the IRA called a convention, and the majority rejected the right of the Irish Parliament to dissolve the Republic. The two sides almost fought over who would occupy Limerick. In April 1922, an anti-treaty group led by Rory O'Connor occupied the center of the court system in Dublin. Collins managed to avoid war in the short term by organizing a pact with Eamon de Valera to reunite Sinn Féin. Collins also initiated a similar tactic with the anti-treaty IRA. In June of 1922, the first elections were held in the Free State, but just before the pact between the pro- and anti-treaty sides broke down over the inclusion of the British monarch and the Free State's constitution, leading to the outbreak of war.
June 28, 1922 marked the official start of the Irish Civil War. When the leader of the pro-treaty group, Michael Collins, borrowed guns from Britain, it led to the Battle of Dublin. This battle raged on for 8 days in the streets, leaving over 250 injured and 60 dead from both sides. The anti-treaty IRA members had taken over the Four Courts building with the help of Rory O'Connor in April of 1922 in Dublin. The provisional government, led by Michael Collins, began bombarding the Four Courts on June 28th with the British 18-pounder field guns. When the first attack proved to be unsuccessful, a second day of firing took place with the help of more British arms, eventually leading to the surrender of the Four Courts. The Four Courts had caught fire with all of the shooting, leading to an explosion in the Irish Public Record Office, destroying 1,000 years' worth of archives. After all of the fighting in Dublin had stopped, the Free State government was in complete control of the capital. Fighting continued while National Army troops began taking on Republican forces. A battle with heavy artillery broke out at King John's Castle against the Republicans who were in control of the castle. It became under fire, but National troops failed to take the castle at first, but were successful 8 days later on July 19th. In August of 1922, the National Army troops discovered that Republicans had plans to destroy all bridges that led into Dublin, cutting off the city from any additional support or supplies. Troops of the anti-treaty party were captured at bridges, demolishing most of the anti-treaty party that was left in Dublin. After Republicans had fled Cork City and the National Army took over, Michael Collins was killed in an ambush, drastically prolonging the war and creating even more resistance between the anti- and pro-treaty parties.
By early 1923, the anti-treaty IRA's offensive capabilities were weakening. The anti-treaty IRA's guerrilla campaign gave the government a serious security problem, which eventually led to the execution of anti-treaty fighters. In retaliation, the IRA assassinated pro-treaty member Sean Hales, and in revenge for that, 4 IRA leaders, Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey, and Richard Barrett, were instantly executed. Between 77 and 81 Republicans were officially executed, and another 100 to 150 were assassinated or instantly killed in the field. The worst instance of this occurred in Cary, where, in retaliation from a bomb attack in 1923, killed 5 National Army soldiers within a week. 17 prisoners were killed in 3 separate incidents after being tied to landmines, which were then ignited. By the spring of 1923, the Republicans' campaign had been reduced mainly to the destruction of property, such as the railway lines. Around 12,000 had been imprisoned. Liam Lynch, the Republican leader, was killed in a battle in the Knockmildown Mountains in County Tipperary on April 10th. The National Army had extracted information from Republican prisoners in Dublin that the IRA executive was in the area, and as well as killing Lynch, they also captured senior anti-treaty IRA officers Dan Breen, Todd Andrews, Sean Gaynor, and Frank Barrett in the operation. It has been said that the death of Lynch allowed the more reasonable Frank Aiken, who took over as IRA Chief of Staff, to call a halt to what seemed a hopeless struggle. Aiken's agreement to IRA leadership was followed on April 30th by the declaration of a ceasefire on behalf of the anti-treaty forces. On May 24, 1923, Aiken followed this with an order to IRA volunteers to dump arms rather than surrender them or continue a fight which they were incapable of winning. The people who fought in favor of the treaty won the Civil War.
It took a long time for the violence to die down. Both sides kept committing general atrocities long after the ceasefire. For months, Republican leaders were slowly arrested. Many Republican prisoners facilitated a hunger strike, but it did little more than bolstering morale. Free Republicans continued to engage in activities such as burning down historical buildings and threatening Loyalists and Protestants in the South, which culminated in someone burning down a Protestant orphanage. That's right, the Civil War was so brutal that burning orphans seemed reasonable in the aftermath. Meanwhile, the pro-treaty government, put into place by a general election in which the pro-Free State Party won, slowly and happily executed their anti-treaty prisoners. The bloody war cost an uncountable number of lives, as in literally no one has figured out how many people died. Government records indicate a mid-war soldier death of a total of 800, but of course many more died after that. We don't know how many civilians were killed, but we do know that several political leaders, perhaps most notably Michael Collins, were among the dead. As you'd expect, Ireland's economy was left in shambles after the war, and not just because of all the money spent on typical war costs. The Republicans had left a lot of destruction in their wake, having nearly scorched earth the country. Everywhere they occupied, they dismantled railroads, burned businesses and administrative buildings, and generally wrecked everything in sight. Of course, this left Ireland with both battered business and a necessarily huge budget for repairs. Because of their economic troubles, the Free State was unable to keep up with their imperial debt payments. This was significant later. During boundary negotiations, the Free State's debt was forgiven in exchange for letting Northern Ireland keep their border the way they liked it. The Sinn Féin fell apart, giving rise to Ireland's 2 biggest political parties, the Fine Gael from the pro-treaty side and the Fine Gael from the anti-treaty side. These 2 parties fought for control until fairly recent elections. The bitterness between them, however, has always been strong. Time did little to dissipate the Civil War tensions, even after most of the issues over which it was fought were more or less settled. In addition, the Unionist suspicions about nationalists, that is, that they were dangerous, unpredictable dirtbags, were confirmed. As a result, many Ulster authorities strengthened their laws designed to keep nationalists out of office. Meanwhile, the IRA had been pitted against itself, but they were far from gone. In fact, they remained a strong force after the war ended, both inside and outside the new Free State. For instance, several of the Northern IRA members joined the Free State's National Army, but were united in old IRA values by General Liam Tobin. But most IRA members ended up populating the new Fine Gael party, which gained quite a bit of power over the years to come. They slowly pushed farther and farther from British control with little resistance up to 1948, when the Free State finally became the Republic of Ireland. The troubles, however, were far from over.